Well, welcome to another lesson of the Beginner's Guide to DXCP course. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me, Marcelo, at headlesscreator.com. In today's lesson, we're talking about choosing the right digital experience architecture for your business. And with my guest presenter, Darren Warnaccia from Uniform. And full disclosure, Uniform acquired Headless Creator, God, a little bit over a year ago, which is unbelievable to think. But, so I work for Uniform. Regardless, it's going to be some great content. So with that said, let's bring him on. Darren, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. Warnaccia, did I say it right?
You got it.
And I did it without doing this. I told you I couldn't, but I did it. Anyway, glad to have you. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I mean, what we're going to be covering today is definitely a hot topic. It's on everybody's mind, right? Choosing the right architecture. Before we do that, and before you get into your presentation, give us a little bit about your background. I mean, you've been in technology probably as long as I've been, and give us a little bit of that.
Yeah, I have always been a tinkerer. I think you and I were talking earlier today about our first computers, and I think mine was the TI 994A and the TRS-80 and all those super early
The
tech.
Trash 80 for those that
The
really know
Trash
it.
80. Oh yeah, that brings back memories. And so I've always tinkered, and through my evolution in college, I realized that I wanted to be a computer scientist, and so after leaving college, got into IT work, building big database systems, but eventually got lured into the siren song of the internet. And back when the internet was shiny and new, and I've been just doing tech and software and consulting across a bunch of different companies ever since then, and really fell in love with building product, marketing product, selling product, and really solving customer problems with technology.
What is it that so you like the mixture of the tech with the customer experience, merging those? Is that what it is that attracts you to stay in this business for so long?
It is. I love outcomes. I always talk about outcomes,
Hmm.
and like what is it that like our end-to-end customer wants, like with our whatever product you're selling. And you could be selling a hairbrush, you could be selling beauty products. There's an outcome that every customer wants, and I love helping brands figure out how to get to the outcome better. And using digital experiences is a great way to sort of get to that outcome beyond just the product.
Right, definitely. Well, and speaking of, we're gonna let you get started because that's what people are here. For those of you watching live, remember you can put a question in the chat and I'll ask Darren. Darren, I'm gonna go away, but if I have questions or users have questions, I'll come right back. So it's all yours, sir.
Look forward to it. All right, let's jump in. So let's talk a little bit about why. Why did we create this content in the first place? And I realized that there's a lot of confusion in the market about like what to do, like what's this headless stuff? What's composable, and how to do this the right way, or what's the best things for me? And I was getting customer questions all the time about this. So I sat down and we jotted out some notes about really what the patterns were and really what your choices are. And really like every choice, there's benefits, there's pros, there's cons, and there's a who is it best for and why. So we're going to cover that today. And so let's start with some definitions. The first definition you may have heard is monolith, or monolithic. Monolithic meaning mono meaning one. And so these are the vendors that have been out there for a very long time, and they've really built everything into the all-in-one stack. Think about this as like the old stereos of the 80s where it had a CD player, it had a tape deck, it had a record player, everything was stitched into one. And when a new piece of technology came along, say a DVD, there's no way to incorporate it because everything was kind of hard coded together and glued together. And so one single monolithic piece of technology, and it's really hard to include other stuff. Then the second definition is headless. Now, headless is one of those funny words because it's the definition of what it isn't, meaning it doesn't have a head. But really the idea behind headless is what people call decoupled architecture, meaning I'm going to start to separate the pieces of the stack. And so the thing that paints the page, the thing that creates the actual end user experience that feeds the web browser, that is separate from the actual raw system behind it that actually creates the infrastructure, the content, the logic. And so you really are separating those two things. So the head versus the body is the logic, the body is the content, and then the head is what it's to look like. It's the lipstick. It's the paint that goes on top. And so that really was an expression and really a way to solve for and a way to overcome the limitations of monolithic systems. Developers, designers wanted more freedom. So they created this separation where the head could be completely independent of however the content was stored and managed and structured. And then along came this idea of MACH. Now, MACH is an acronym. It stands for Microservices, APIs, Cloud, and Headless. And it was really a way of vendors helping identify themselves. And a nonprofit org came out of this to say, like, what is the difference between, say, some of these folks that were born in a pre-cloud era versus these newer vendors born in a post-cloud era where everything was cloud native, everything was built to be purely microservices versus the vendors that are sort of trying to immigrate into this new cloud space. And so that's really the difference is these mock vendors are really born natively in the cloud. They are built, everything is built around APIs and microservices. Everything is built cloud native and tend to be consumed in an incremental way versus having to buy a chunk of software and then deploy that chunk of software into, let's say, a cloud infrastructure like Azure or AWS and one of their containers. So that's really the big difference in terms of MACH. And we'll talk more about MACH maturity, like how MACH is something. It's almost a shades of gray, and we'll unpack that because there's something that's happening in the industry called MACH washing. MACH washing meaning vendors who are trying to claim that they are that when they really aren't. And so there's a bit of controversy about that. And then the last term is composable. Composable is this idea that things are modular and replaceable. Now you might ask, well, why is that any different than, say, APIs? It is different because the idea and the intention is different. Composability is the idea of how easy is it to actually remove something or swap something out or add something or like change things. And the idea that if you are really composable, then it is very easy to do that. And it's measured in that ability and the easiness in which things can be added, removed, replaced. But a lot of vendors are confusing and muddying up the waters by jumping in and saying, hey, we're composable because they have some APIs. But that is not necessarily the same. Sometimes they're different.
Quick question for you, because obviously if anybody spends any time on social media, you're going to start seeing all companies claiming composability. I mean, it's basically keywords that they want to attract. Why are our vendor, I mean, are they truly becoming composable? Are they trying to migrate to full composability, or why are they doing? Why? I mean, this is muddying up for everybody, and unfortunately, I think the side effect of this is that truly composable systems, for example, like Uniform, right, will start getting a bad rap because these others, quote unquote, are composable, but they're not really composable. So I mean, how can we kind of prevent this, and why are companies doing this? And if you're going to cover this in future slides, we can wait until then.
I think it's a good point to just keep touching on across this entire presentation because this is the reason why we actually created this lesson in the first place. There is so much confusing. Vendors will generally jump on to the latest, greatest thing.
Right.
That's a very common marketing tactic.
I mean, I'm seeing AI everywhere now, right? It doesn't matter if you do AI or not. Boom, put AI because that's the hot thing.
It's the bandwagon effect.
Right.
You want to be considered, the hot thing, the new thing, and so that's very common. And so everyone is claiming that they're composable. It's not a black or white thing, too. I think what we'll talk about today is there's some shades of gray here. There's a continuum of how composable are you, and we have some definitions around like what makes somebody low composability versus high composability. I think that's also a fair statement. People could be on a composable journey if you're a legacy vendor. Maybe you are Monolith, but you realize that you need to navigate to this new composable world. It's going to take you years, but you got to start somewhere. So maybe you have a chunk. Maybe you acquire somebody who is actually composable,
Right.
but the whole platform isn't, but maybe a piece is. And so you claim composability, but really you're just early on your journey. And I think I'll point some of that out today.
And from the enterprise perspective, the reality is it's not going to be a clear cut, oh, we're monolithic only or we're headless only. I mean, in an enterprise, you're probably going to have a blend. We did a podcast on that where you're probably going to have a blend of a mixture of these, right, throughout the organization.
Of course, your architecture itself, is a mixture of many
Right.
technologies. So if you have a continuum of this, then you also need to ask yourself, how do I make sure my architecture itself is also composable? Because there's also a raging debate about like what is really composable. And what is really digital experience platforms in general? Is it the
Yeah.
end solution you build and assemble from all of these technologies, or is it the vendor's tech itself? I think it's both. I think you
Right.
can measure these things and you can consider this the same way across both technology vendors and what you do with them.
Yep, definitely. Cool. I'll let you continue.
Okay. So just to wrap up back on composable, I think the idea here is think composable is not headless. Composable is swappability, replaceability, addability. And how easy is that to do that? So what we started to think about is if these things are distinct and different, if composable is about swappability, and then mock maturity is really how good are your headless capabilities, your API capabilities, how natively cloud are you, and how good and strong and rich are your microservices? Because again, those are not an on or off; those are a continuum. Then we want to measure both of those as two different axes on a grid, on a scale. And so we plotted those into a classic 2x2 grid to help people understand really what are those architectural choices that you might make. So what does that look like? So what that looks like is this grid that shows composable and composability as an index, as a continuum on the vertical axis. And then on the horizontal axis, we have mock maturity. And mock maturity meaning like how natively SaaS are you? How natively cloud? How good are your APIs and how headless are you? Are you immigrating into this space and you have pieces, or are you like native, part of the mock alliance and really having very rich, very mature APIs, and how rigorous and strong is your infrastructure? So it's really looking at those two axes. Now, on the composability index, I think about this as low would be everything's in code. You have to write everything. So swapping things out is harder because you've written a lot of glue code, and that glue code that binds those pieces together is much harder. Now we see different technologies out there in the market now. DXC is one of them that makes the whole integration and configuration very configuration driven and very business user driven. And so we see the shift there. So I'll say high is when you have thought about how you compose things in a business user configuration driven way, and that is the best that you can do on composability. And that makes it very simple. So you don't have to go to developers all the time. Sometimes you will want to, but you don't have to all the time. And the idea is that you can configure things and set those up. So what happens when you have low composability and low mock maturity? Well, that's your legacy monolith. That is that vendor that probably started 20 odd years ago and built everything for an on-premise world and coded everything together into that single unified stack, right? And they wanted vendor lock-in because that was their strategy. And so they wanted you in their own walled garden and they didn't want you to go anywhere. Now, we saw other vendors who either through acquisition or just good discipline kept the integrations between those big blocks together, but that they built suites. And so they have more configuration driven capabilities. They have done a better job of making things more configurable, but you still lose something. You still lose something when you swap something out. It is configuration driven, but the APIs are not that strong. They're not that headless. They're not that, they might have one or two, but they're not really built around that. And they're really not cloud scalable. Still things live in containers. They tend to be deployed in infrastructure as a service or iPaaS as they call it. And so a lot of times then they aren't very, they're not mock in that way. Now shifting to the bottom right, what happens when you have very high mock maturity, but everything takes code to integrate? That's what's happening in many of the cases today. And that's what we call composed mock monolith. So you built things, but you even though the pieces themselves, the vendors themselves are all very mock, you have stitched them together in code. You've built them around glue code. And I often poke fun at the glue monster, this glue monster that happens that you wind up painting yourself in a corner with a lot of code. And to undo that or to change something later is ungluing that thing by unpicking out the code and then rewriting new code. And so you created this new solution using a bunch of vendors like we talked about earlier, Marcel. But now you've composed yourself, meaning the glue dried and now you're painted in a situation, and it's harder to move that. And then the top right is, of course, if you do everything in a configuration driven way, if you really pick vendors that are high mock maturity, and then you assemble them in a very loosely coupled way, And you've built tooling so that your business users can be changing things, your business users can be adapting things. Now you have what we call composable MACH. And that means that it continues to be composable. It doesn't just get composed, the glue doesn't dry ever, because everything is now built to be configured and adapted. You're really optimizing for agility. It takes a little bit more thought though to do that, and you have to really pick your vendor as well.
And I know
Pause here
you're
for
going
a
to go
question.
into the pros and cons of all this stuff, but I think this graph is a really good graph because not only is a great graph to choose the vendor and what your future infrastructure looks like, but also if you're developing an app, looking at this graph, you should really be at the top right or close to the top right as possible, right? So that way even your app as you're developing it becomes truly composable.
Yeah, and this is where we get to the solution space. Like this applies more as much to your solution as the vendors you choose,
Exactly.
because you can pick those very composable vendors,
Right.
but you can still do bad things to them. And
Right.
like every architecture, you can use a technology badly. And so thinking as an architect about staying loosely coupled and building things in a way that allow your business community, your business users, your marketers, your merchandisers to be able to adapt and quickly iterate through things and try things and even try different technologies. Maybe you try a CDP and it didn't work out for you, so you're going to take that one out and put another one in. That idea of iterating quickly is becoming very common, particularly in the growth marketer space.
But how do we change the way of thinking? Because I think most people, most enterprises tend to fall, not when choosing a vendor, but even designing an architecture on the bottom left, the monolith, right? They end up, they all start with like, we're going to be composable, we're going to do APIs, but then they end up the glue monster. They end up gluing everything and everything becomes a huge suite. Does it require evangelizing this more? Does it require re-educating people at the top? Is it at where developers are I mean, what's your take on this?
I think the people who can affect this most are architects, because
Yeah,
and I think one of the challenges in building these modern technologies is what the idea of being unopinionated. I think organizations need to form an opinion, a design philosophy, an architectural point of view about how they want to do that. A lot of times we leave that to the devs in a team to just decide, and I think that's a mistake. I think what needs to happen is architectural leadership and brands need to have an opinion about how they want to design things. If you if if you don't have a destination, then any road will do. I
mm,
think if you want to stay composable, if you want to have that agility, which is why you buy these technologies in the first place, if you want that to be durable and consistent, then I think you need to have an opinion as an architect, as an IT leadership function that says we're going to maintain loosely coupled systems. We are going to ensure business user capability versus expediency of we need to get this project out the door. We're going to hard code all this stuff, which is
right.
a lot of times what happens.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the next slides you're gonna give some more information as to why one is better than the other. So I'll let you continue.
Okay. Well, let's jump in. So given all that, let's just talk about the four quadrants. Now, I don't think anyone really wants to live in legacy monolith land, but let's just talk about what the benefits are. The odds are you bought this thing 5 to 6 years ago and it's paid for. Maybe you're paying some low-end maintenance costs, but it's pretty cheap to maintain. So it's something you're going to keep going for now. You might be thinking about other solutions, but you're here now. The problem, of course, is it's inflexible. It's hard to add things to it. The vendors have successfully locked you in, and now it's expensive upgrades. Like it's not uncommon for some of these large monolithic systems to require a $500,000 to upgrade them just to stay in place. No new features, just to move from version A to version B. And proprietary technology, these technologies were built, again, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's all built on proprietary tech. And then finding skilled resources is getting harder and harder. People are moving on. People are moving to these more modern technologies, and no dev really wants to work on this anymore. So it's going the way of COBOL, if you will. But who is this best for? It's still appropriate for some companies. It's still appropriate for lower maturity brands, people who are risk adverse and really want to see things shake out. And brands that just aren't investing in customer experience. It's not a priority. If you're a commodity vendor where there's no value in customer experience, maybe this isn't important. and maybe this isn't where you want to spend your money, or you're in such a low margin business that it just doesn't make sense to spend money here. So those are valid reasons to stay here. Now, the suite technologies, the benefit, of course, one vendor contracts, right? You can buy everything from one vendor. People still do that. There are still large orgs that like to buy a single thing. I like to call it integration via purchase order, but you're buying everything, and procurement likes that. Procurement often likes to be able to have that. You do have pre-integrated things across different adjacent capabilities, but like that one size fits all, there's going to be unevenness. Usually vendors start from a particular capability set and then grow. And that starting capability set is always the strongest, and everything else they add later is never as good. So you're always going to compromise in some capability. They do also have broader ecosystems of integrators. The Adobes, the Sitecores of the world, but they do have large swaths of integration capability. So resource pools are still pretty good size, although they are starting to shrink. People, again, are moving towards these new modern capability sets. The problem here and the con is it is also inflexible. It is inflexible. You are still locked in. It is a little easier to integrate third-party products, but again, proprietary technologies as well. It's a little easier. It's still not that great, and your developer teams are still frustrated by how much they are constrained by how the vendor wants you to work and how they want you to build things. Again, who is this great for? It's best for people who have that low to mid maturity on the digital front, like their emissions are medium to low. And the in-house engineering teams tend to be light. They tend to be weaker. They tend to outsource almost everything, and they're happy to have an agency or a system integrator do a lot of the work for them. For brands like that, this still can be quite appropriate, and again, it can often be you've paid for this already, and they may have asked you to move to a cloud contract, but still the costs are a bit lower. Although they are starting to ratchet up now. I think the word on the street is many of these vendors are now starting to force customers to their new cloud offerings, which are getting significantly more expensive. Okay, so now we've gone to the bottom right. And the bottom right is the composed MACH Monolith. So now you've bought multiple solutions from maybe multiple vendors, and you've actually hard coded that together. Now, I think the benefit here is that the learning curve is a little lower, because you can often leverage some of the out-of-the-box pre-integrated things from these vendors. Many of these vendors have a little ecosystem around kind of starter connectors between system A and system B. They still require development. They still require building and hard coding things together. But it's a little easier to get started. So a lot of brands are choosing this. There is a decent set of modern standards to actually use these technologies, and because MACH has a consistent set of the way they present themselves, and the documentation tends to be very good, there's a much bigger pool of developers out there that you can tap into. These front-end developers are much cheaper often than, say, one of these legacy developers that are hard to find. And so that the actual resource base is much bigger. The downside is you're dealing with multiple vendor contracts. Now, you might be dealing with a CMS vendor and maybe a digital asset management vendor, maybe a commerce vendor, perhaps a search vendor. Now you're negotiating multiple contracts across all those vendors. It does require significant maintenance over time. That glue code, that integration code, does age out. APIs change, vendors upgrade services, libraries age out. And so there is a lot higher load on the maintenance front. And oftentimes, especially if this is done in a hurry, sometimes that's not your best work. Integration code can get a little messy. Sometimes it gets delegated to the junior dev on the team, and all of a sudden now you've got something that is going to require a complete rebuild after a year and a half. You can get locked in here with vendors too. Surprisingly, that when you get composed, you can also get locked in, especially as you start really tightly coupling all these components together. Pretty soon, this is such a tall mountain to climb to unpick things. You just start living with it, much like you did in the Monolith world. So what you were hoping for in terms of agility and flexibility, you actually boxed yourself out of, because you painted yourself in a corner with glue code. And often, business user tooling is not as robust as it was in the suite places, in the suite products. The suite products had very good business user tooling, and in the headless MACH world, it's not quite as robust. We have not filled in many of those gaps. So you can actually have unhappy marketers and unhappy merchandisers and content contributors, because now the tool sets that they're used to working with, are nowhere near as good. as they were before, but they're great for devs. These types of solutions are wonderful for developers, and developers love them. So it's about finding the balance and making sure that your marketing teams are okay with that. I think who is this best for? I think this is best for brands that traditionally lean on a build mentality versus a buy mentality. They love custom development. They love owning their own stuff. And they value the best of breed approach, because you are able to pick the best CMS with the best DAM, with the best search engine, and wire it together exactly how you want it. And that's very appealing to certain brands, and certain organizations lean that way. Now the last one is Composable MACH. And in Composable MACH, is one of those architectures that's designed to evolve. It assumes that you are going to have to iterate often, and you're going to have to try things and replace things. The central premise behind Composable MACH is that there's so much innovation going on in this world that you don't know what's going to be there tomorrow, and you really want to be able to take advantage of it. You want to be able to add and replace technologies and capabilities as you need to. You don't want to be locked in. You want negotiating power with any of your vendors. You don't want that lock-in. You want to make sure that workflows and tooling is good for business users and developers. You want to make sure that those teams play well and play to their strength. And you want high scalability and speed to deployment. I think those become very, very important. And you want that over time. What can often happen when you get composed is that decays very quickly as you have more and more tech debt to manage and deal with in your integration code. The idea behind Composable MACH is that you never have that situation. And in fact, you get faster over time, not slower over time. The downside, again, you are still dealing with multiple vendor contracts, and you may actually even have to buy additional components like a DXC to actually allow yourself to continue with that agility. You do need to have seasoned architects that really value, Marcelo, what you said, this idea of staying loosely coupled and really having that opinion, being very opinionated about your design philosophy, making sure you stay loosely coupled and make sure that you're not making those trade-offs. And you want to make sure that your marketing teams and your development teams want to work seamless together, and you really think about that. So it's when you can actually bring those worlds together, and they're not very disparate, separated teams. They're actually teams you're used to and that want to work best together.
Real quick, so from a team size, with all of these, we're talking about mainly for enterprise here, right?
I think
You're
those are
going to
the
need
vendors
a
that get the
larger
best.
team.
Yeah, I think that those are the teams that get the best value out of this, and
Right.
they often also have the most ambition. I think the
Right.
who this is best for, right? It's mature organizations. They're digitally mature. They're ambitious. They're larger teams. They often have multiple sites, often in multiple geos. They because this scales across 50,
Right.
100, and particularly if you're trying to deliver things around the world, then speed matters, and that's where I think Composable and MACH in general really help. Being able to deliver things from the edge really help in how fast you can scale and deploy.
Because if you're a small business, you're not going to have the team to implement this. This will require, at a minimum, a small team to focus and implement and develop, right?
Yeah, unless, I mean, the exception, I guess, that would prove the rule is, let's say you're a digital only startup who is operating, in this new world and building your product and your web experiences purely. Like, let's say you're a e-commerce vendor, even though you're smaller, you've got the mindset of one of these mature organizations, and you've been
Right.
building all those things.
Right. Or if you're smaller, but you want to scale to that big enterprise later on, you want to start and do it the right way.
That's true too.
Yeah, definitely. Cool.
Okay. So who is this best for? Again, the ambitious team, the teams that value time to market and speed to adaptation. The idea of speed to learning is becoming really prevalent in the marketing and commerce spaces. Like, how fast can you learn? How fast can you iterate and optimize? Because if you can out iterate your competition, you're going to win. It's also an organization that values strong business tooling in combination with great developer support. So it's that better together, best of both worlds story that is really important, and values the best of need solution, but knows that, like, they're going to start here, but they're going to evolve, and they make the assumption that things are going to have to be replaced eventually, and then they build for that. They build for that loosely coupling, and if you're valuing that as an organization, then that makes sense for you. Okay, so how does this all lay out? Like what vendors look like that? So like on the legacy monolith front, you've got a lot of these legacy DXPs out there. Again, built 20 years ago, haven't really modernized, haven't really navigated towards this new world. And as we move up, then composable DXPs. This is where I think you were asking earlier, Marcelo. Like these composable DXPs, all these vendors are now slapping the word composable on their software. But the reality is, pieces are composable. Pieces are, they've acquired somebody, they've thrown a couple APIs in front of some technology. Most of this stuff still running in containers, not really built cloud native, not multi-tenant SaaS, but they're making progress. And so I think the credit goes to them, but they're not really MACH yet. They've got a long way to go. They've got 3 to 5 years to really rebuild everything in a MACH-centric way. So that this puts a lot of those vendors up there. Any vendor really calling themselves a composable DXP, they're likely in this bucket. Now, composed MACH is an interesting one. You see a lot of the marketplace vendors, so a lot of these large vendors, and then also system integrators are creating what they're calling accelerators. So they're either kind of off-the-shelf, accelerator frameworks, but again, they're just a bunch of code. They're a bunch of code that was built to help, either an agency or an SI, or maybe it's in a vendor marketplace. So let's talk about composable monolith. I think these are the agency accelerators, the SI accelerators, and even a lot of the MACH vendors have marketplaces where they'll give you starter kits and prefabbed connectors. But again, these are just really chunks of code that you then take and you own and you build on. So these are really just prefabricated blocks of glue. And really, they're just giving you a jump start on building those things, but you're still building a bunch of glue. And I think that is, something that's what makes that composability lower, because they're still not built around configurability. They're not built for business users. They're still really built for developers to get started faster. And they do shorten up the build time. But again, you're still going to be living with that tech debt. You're still going to have that code you have to own and you have to manage. And then composable MACH, the technologies out there now, digital experience composition platforms, as an example, those vendors are really seeking to make this a configuration-driven exercise built for business users, building business user tooling that then assemble and orchestrate all of those tools for you. And so I think that is where that space is coming. So if we talk about who is an example of this, like who would be a legacy DXP, who would be a composable DXP, bespoke accelerators, and then digital experience composition platforms. So on the legacy DXP front, folks like Optimizely and Acquia are good examples. They're still monolithic. They haven't really built a lot of APIs across their systems. They're still really focusing in on owning you and keeping you in that walled garden. They've been around for a long time, 10 plus years, and they built that pre-integrated, prefabricated tool set together. On the composable DXP, we see Adobe and Sitecore as good examples. They've done some work trying to become more open. They've built some integrations, but you give up things when you leave their walled garden. You may go use some of their capabilities, but the minute you don't use their whole set, things fall away. The capabilities fall away. Personalization doesn't work if you don't use some of their other technologies, and so things like that. There's some gotchas in there. So again, I think they're moving there that way. They're going to try and get there, but it's a 3 to 5 year journey, maybe longer. Bespoke accelerators and really these agency accelerators, there's great examples of this. Orium has their own accelerator toolkits. Publicis Sapient has their own starter kits and frameworks. And again, most of the headless CMS vendors also have their marketplaces and starter kits and things like that. But again, they're glue code. They're just sort of glue code that someone got started for you. And then on the digital experience composition platform front, we have, of course, Uniform and what Uniform's trying to do around really assembling and making these things, keeping you from being composed and helping you stay composable. Another vendor, Octu, is really trying to solve this on the API integration aggregation front, really allowing you to not have to hard code a lot of those things and actually build those in a configuration-oriented way. Again, a lot of work and a lot of innovation happening in this space. But I think the real thing to consider as an architect, as someone building these types of systems, is what can you do to stay composable? What can you do to stay loosely coupled? And how can you both serve your development audience and your business user audience, your marketers, your merchandisers, your content editors? How do you support them all in that balanced way and stay composable so that you can be adapting and iterating and learning? So with that, I think that's it. Let's jump over to questions.
You've answered all the questions. What I do want to do is go back a little bit real quick to this. And if anything, people out of this entire presentation, use this graph right here to make your decisions when you're choosing your vendors and figuring out, what would be great, and maybe we can come up with later on for people, is have questions and parameters they can use to start categorizing what do they have, right? So they can start placing their systems in this graph properly, and the right questions to ask when you're looking at vendors. Perhaps maybe you can touch a little bit upon that. What are some questions that enterprises can ask when they're looking at vendors to make sure they're leaning towards the top right and not the bottom left?
Yeah, those are some. So to get started, like if you think about the axes and the labels on the axes, so some questions are like, what does it take to actually integrate third-party systems, or how easy is it for me to remove this feature or that feature and put another vendor's feature in? So I think that's question number one. And can you show me how? I think that's another, like, what is it going to take to do that? And you watch to see, is that vendor breaking out a code editor and showing you in code, or are they showing you a UI where a business person can go do those things? And you can even build proof of concepts around that and push the vendors to show you and let you see it, let you do it, and make sure that it is not just smoke and mirrors, but it actually works that way.
Right.
On the sort of the MACH maturity axes, I think that's where you start to ask, okay, are you a part of the MACH Alliance? Can you show me, your certification? Can you help me understand, how we deploy to you, and is that in a private container? Is that like vendor managed cloud container, or is that really truly multi-tenant SaaS? How robust is that? Can I see your API docs? How rich and mature are those? How robust is it? What kinds of, do they have the maturity around API rate limiting? Do they have, what does that all look like? Because the most mature MACH vendors will have all of those things. And so you can really gauge them, versus are they a DXP trying to masquerade as, as
Right.
composable? They're going to not be able to answer all those questions.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Darren, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If people want to get a hold of you besides the email, it would be, you had it in your slides. I'm going to bring the slide back up here. I think you had it at the end there. Yep, there you go. The LinkedIn and the Twitter right there. That's the best?
That's the best.
Awesome.
And of course, my email.
And your email, which is right there below your name. So Darren, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with the community.
Glad to be here.
Thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for many more coming soon. And as always, if you want to get a hold of me, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. So until the next one, have a great one, everybody.